Okay, well I think we'll get started. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Burrubi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which CSU's campuses are located, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. We'd like to welcome you today to our third guest lecture for this week, which is launching the We Imagine series, which is a new program that You Imagine has launched as a way of engaging both the CSU community and the communities in which we are involved across our regions, with exploring a number of different topics that relate to innovation. And the first topic in our series is data, and so We Imagine Data is our program which we're running for the next 5 weeks. And we are really fortunate to be doing this in partnership with CSU's Adaptive Learning and Teaching Services team from the Learning Technologies Unit. And we had a great meeting yesterday to plan a great program, and it's going to be great. So we're really looking forward to exploring data with the two teams and with the broader CSU community. I'd like to welcome those people who are live streaming to this event today. We actually have a Bridget session where you can actually open and look at a close-up view of the slides. You'll find the URL for that is provided in the chat in your live stream interface. And we are happy to field questions from people who are listening in today, both here with live stream and in the audience via Twitter. Our hashtag that we're using for our season is #WeImagineData. So if you would like to share with the wider world about what you're listening to today, please feel free to use that hashtag. And if you want to keep up in touch with what is happening over the next few weeks with our We Imagine Data program, if you'd like to follow us on Twitter with our Twitter handle, YouImagine_CSU. I'd now like to hand over to Cass, Dr Cass Colvin, who's the manager of the Adaptive Learning and Teaching Services team, to introduce our guest speaker for today. Thanks, Cass. Thank you.
Hi, it's with pleasure that I welcome Dr Rebecca Ferguson to the CSU community. Rebecca is a senior lecturer at Open University UK in their Institute of Educational Technology. She's also a senior fellow with the Higher Education Academy in the UK. Rebecca is actually a leading researcher and I guess thought leader in learning analytics. She is represented on a number of large European Union funded projects, British funded projects, and is also on the senior executive of the peak body for learning analytics internationally. That's the Society for Learning Analytics Research. So we're actually very, very lucky to have her here at CSU. Rebecca's been here for 2 days and has certainly touched many people in the community with her knowledge and wisdom. So thank you for visiting us, and we look forward to your speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Cass. A lovely introduction. So, those of you who were at my talk yesterday or heard it on the live stream, it was quite an upbeat talk. It was like, this is where we're going with learning analytics, let's think about the future, let's do the positives. Now this is a sort of companion piece, and it's a slightly more downbeat one. So ideally we would have done the internal one first, down, gone up with the public one, but we happen to have done it this way round. So it's a little bit more downbeat, but I think it ends with a sort of positive aspect to it. And it's around steering clear of failure. And yesterday I was talking around work which the Learning Analytics Community Exchange in Europe carried out around educational futures. Another set of work that we carried out was around the evidence on learning analytics. What evidence have we got that learning analytics is doing what we say it is? And the answers are a little bit more depressing than we hoped they were at the beginning. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit and then about what the implications for that are. And this is work I did with my colleague at the Open University, Dr Cloud. Doug and I work well together. I'm primarily a qualitative researcher, even though I work in learning analytics, and Doug is very much a quantitative researcher. We also have a different sort of style of slides. Doug is very much a, here's a big picture, let's talk about the big picture, and I'm a, here's a smaller picture, and here are some words with it. So as we go through, you can identify which slides Doug had a really big hand in, and which ones I had more of a hand in. And I've been sneaking more text into these things as we go. So this is Doug's sort of big ship of learning analytics failure. This is what we want to steer clear of, and how are we going to do that? So one of the things that I get when I talk about learning analytics, or in fact any form of educational technology research, people go, well, why don't you do it more like medical research? You know, medical research has really strict patterns of evidence and data, and how do we know that this is true, and how do we know that this is not true? And there is, in fact, this fairly well-established hierarchy of where you want to be on the evidence tree. And down here at the bottom, the animal and lab studies, they're sort of pretty low level. What you want to be doing is you want to be up at the top of the pyramid. And particularly when you talk to people from medicine or from related hard sciences, they go, well, you know, you need to be on this tree. So when we were thinking about what is the evidence in terms of learning analytics, Doug, whose family are all medics, brought out this and said, right, we will put everything onto this. And it was actually rather depressing to find that we're somewhere below the pyramid at this stage. For many reasons, which is worth thinking about. So one of the things people talk about is randomised controlled trials. And if you were at my colleague Bart's talk the other day, Bart is very interested in randomised controlled trials and is carrying some out. And we are as a field moving towards that. But of course randomised controlled trials aren't always the best way forward, because if one failure means somebody crashing to earth, or if one failure means somebody failing who didn't fail, there's a whole ethics around randomised controlled trials, which means they're quite difficult to carry out in education. And even if you feel as a researcher fairly secure that you're not putting your learners in any danger of failure, when you talk to the educators in the class, in fact when you talk to the learners in the class, they're a bit more wary, because everyone has an eye to passing at the end. So although randomised controlled trials score high on the hierarchy of evidence, they're not easy to carry out in education. They're not necessarily the right thing to do. Now, something we find with learning analytics is it's a relatively new field. The first conference was in 2011, and people have been joining the field since then. A lot of the people who've joined the field are new researchers with less experience perhaps in research methods than people in other areas. And we also find that a lot of the people involved in learning analytics research are practitioners who are primarily interested in what's happening in their classroom, in their school. Again, not necessarily coming with the most sophisticated research methods. So I've discovered on my screen here that a new version of Craft Manager is available. So we're going to skip this version of Craft Manager, I'm sorry to say. Right.
Sorry.
So it's worth thinking about some of the ways in which stats in learning analytics can go wrong. And one of the reasons we were prompted to think about this was what's going on in the field of psychology at the moment. I don't know if many of you have heard about the replication crisis which is going on in psychology at the moment, where psychologists began to think about repeating really major influential studies, and they found that in only 40% of cases did they give the same result as the really major influential study. And so psychology has in some ways gone into a little bit of overdrive panic about this, and thinking, well, the ground is much more shaky. than we thought it was. So we want to make sure that the ground on which learning analytics stand is not shaky, and we're aware from the beginning of the sort of things that can go wrong. And one of... Okay. Click. Should I click at some... What am I clicking about? It's not talking to me. That's not moved. That arrow's moved. That arrow's moved. Right. Be wary of the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is a really important one to be aware of in educational research because you see it popping up all the time. And it refers to it was a series of studies that were carried out, but there was one which people really picked up on, which seemed to show that if you just subtly change the light in a working environment, it got people working more. But then when they went and looked at the data a bit more, what actually proved to be the case is if you study people in detail, they will change what they are doing and they will try to please you. Now we see this enormous amount in educational research. An excited, enthusiastic teacher comes in with an innovation and works with the class for a term or a semester or a year. Really exciting innovation, you know, is full of energy and dynamism. They're a good teacher anyway because they're thinking about this. And lo and behold, the class marks go up. And then at the end of that we go, wow, yes, that is a great innovation. And then next year somebody who's less enthusiastic carries it out and nothing happens whatsoever. So we have to be really careful of the Hawthorne effect because this isn't just learning analytics. I see this time and time again happening across the field of education. And people aren't really aware that they're doing it. They think what they've just done is change the innovation, but they've changed actually how they're teaching, how they're feeding back, the amount of interest they're showing. Now, the next slide, this is one of Doug's favourite things that goes wrong. And this is a piece of research which won an Ig Nobel Award because it's about a post-mortem study of fish. And it's about some people who were doing some work with an fMRI scanner. And apparently, if you're doing work on scanning people's brains with an fMRI scanner, first of all, you produce a neutral set of test data against which you can compare it. And in the past, people had used sort of balloons filled with oil or something. They thought, no, we'll use something more exciting. We will use a dead salmon. So they put a dead salmon into their fMRI scanner, and then they ran their experiments. And they showed the dead salmon sort of various pictures. And the idea was that, you know, you showed human pictures and different areas of their brain would light up. And obviously you showed dead salmon pictures, nothing lights up. Except if you get false positives. And they got false positives, and it showed that the dead salmon really did react to these pictures. And this work has won an Ig Nobel Prize for showing the real importance of thinking about, have I got false positives and should I take those into account? Apparently in papers over the next few years the amount of false positive really changed because people were so impressed by this dead salmon. Now, one that I see in doctoral students a lot, and even doctoral students who are submitting their final thesis, is a problem around p-values. And I don't know if you know the XKCD cartoons, but Randall Munro, who draws them, has a sort of very fine eye around statistics and things that can go wrong with statistics. So here we see some scientists, they're thinking about a p-value. There's a study around jelly beans and acne, and it's like, no, there's not really any link. Here's our p-value, 0.05. So those of you who know much about p-values will know that actually that indicates that in one case in 20, something's going to show up. Just random variation means something's going to show up. Whereas people who don't know very much about p-values will go, that's a really good p-value. Yes, I'm happy with that. I will quote that without any knowledge. So we see in this, that in these 10 cases, They tried out 10 jelly beans, and of course the null hypothesis proved absolutely the case. And then they tried it with another 10, meaning they'd done 20 studies. Green jelly beans cause cancer. Right. No, it's random variation. This is what you would expect with your p-value. But if you don't understand what you're doing with p-values, and I see these quoted all over the place as, yes, I've got a very low p-value, therefore everything I say is correct. Not necessarily. Green jelly beans are not linked to acne, or there's not very high probability they're linked to acne. And I think the final one that I'd pick up on here is the distinction between correlation and causation. Again, you see this a lot in learning analytics. This happened, therefore one must be the result of the other. Of course, they're not necessarily the result of each other. But if people have gone in thinking, I am making a change and I expect to see a change, they will spot the change. And they won't necessarily think, is that just correlation? So we need to bear all these things in mind when we're looking at learning analytics. We need to bear these things in mind when we're encouraging people around us to carry out learning analytics. And when we're talking to learners and educators about data literacy, we need to know that they are aware of these basic traps that you can fall into, because these are traps that it's very easy to fall into, especially if you're expecting to see something happen. So, why do we have these problems? Well, we have these problems because learning is really hard. It's not only hard to learn, it's hard to measure learning, it's hard to understand learning. In fact, you quite often talk to researchers of learning and they'll say, I don't really quite know what learning is. I might know it when I see it, but if you ask me to write a definition, it's a really tricky thing to do. And one of the reasons is we don't really see learning. What we see are the effects of learning. We don't see what's going on exactly inside people's heads unless they're dead salmon. But we tend to look at the proxies for learning. So we do a pre-test and a post-test, or we do self-report. But the problem is that when we do those things, people learn to game them, because people want to succeed at learning. People want to pass. So I'll give you an example of the PISA studies. The PISA studies are incredibly influential around the world. They've been carried out for many years now. Every 3 years, they take a group of 15-year-olds from each country, and they test them on English and on maths and on science, depending on the year, but roughly the same sort of things. There have been critiques of the methodology. They've responded to the critiques. People all over the world are looking at these figures. And what happens? People begin to game them, people begin to cheat, and people begin to misrepresent them. Because what the PISA studies tell us about is some groups of 15-year-olds studying specific subjects. They do not tell us some of the things around here. People overclaim. Are Finland's schools overall slipping because one group of 15-year-olds did a certain way in a test? How do we go to world class in education? Well, can we go to world class in education simply by doing better on the PISA tests, which only test certain subjects and certain things? We can't really, can we? And we see lots of attempts to cheat. And if you look at some of the top countries, you see they've been very selective about the 15-year-olds who went in for that test. So it's tough. It's really tough. So to bring this all back to learning analytics again, I was telling some of you yesterday about the Learning Analytics Community Exchange project in Europe. And one of the things that we were charged with doing was finding the evidence around learning analytics. And what we did was we brought that together in something called the Evidence Hub, which is still up there, that URL is working. Now you can't gather evidence in a vacuum. Evidence has got to be evidence for something or against something. It's no good just gathering something together and say, this is about learning analytics, it's a research study. Well, what does it tell us? So we came up with 4 propositions. A, learning analytics improve learning outcomes. We weren't necessarily saying they do, but we were saying let's find evidence whether they do or they don't. They improve learning support and teaching. That was B. C, they're taken up and used widely. And D, they're used in an ethical way. So we went and looked at the learning analytics literature, which is all the learning analytics conferences, the Journal of Learning Analytics, the educational data mining conferences. And we said, what evidence have we got either for or against these propositions? And we brought out summaries of those. The summaries are in the evidence hub, and then we visualised it. And one of the visualisations is this Sankey diagram here. Sankey diagrams don't come out terribly well when you make them big like this because you lose the greyness. But essentially over here at A, this is all the evidence we had that whether or not they improve learning. The yellow here, whether or not they improve teaching. A bit less on uptake, and not very much about whether they're carried out ethically. A lot of the evidence is from the university sector, quite a lot from the school sector, but workplace, informal learning, cross-sector learning. This was a couple of years ago, this was before all the big MOOC studies started to come out, so informal was still small. And if you look over here, a huge amount of positive evidence and very little negative evidence, which sounds great, doesn't it? All this positive evidence that we're really influencing learning, we're really influencing teaching. But is that credible? Are the people all around the world carrying out all these studies and everything they find is positive? And here's another of our visualisations, sort of showing the balance of evidence around the world. And the green semicircles are the positive evidence, and the blue are the negative evidence. And you will see it only here in South Africa are they balanced. Now I know why that's the case, because South Africa is actually Paul Prinsloo. Paul Prinsloo does work on ethics, and the work on ethics was a bit more balanced. But generally speaking, around the world, we are very positive about what is going on in the field of learning analytics. So we did think we would need to dig into that a bit more deeply, because we should be seeing things not working so well. And we also looked at the research in terms of what's termed the learning analytics cycle. Because learning analytics aren't simply something that you apply and go away. Really what you should have is you should have learners, we've got some data from learners, we do some metrics, we do some interventions, and then it goes round as a cycle. We don't want learning analytics which just stop with the data or which just stop with the metrics. We need those interventions because learning analytics are about optimising learning and about optimising the environments in which it takes place. And we can't use them to optimise it unless we intervene. So we'd expect to see interventions, and we would then expect to see more going on, and not just stopping going, we've intervened, that's all right. We had an idea, we've done it. We want to see some evaluation and some coming back to that. And we didn't see as much of that as we would hope. So we looked around for what were the really good examples. And the best example of learning analytics evidence, this was one which people cited all over the place, was a study from Purdue University, one of the really early ones. And it was a lovely, positive study showing how they rolled out learning analytics. And when you got to the end of the course, the students who'd had the learning analytics intervention were more likely to have been retained. And that held for a couple of years, until a couple of statisticians said, well, okay, let's replace learning analytics with chocolates. And in the first year, we'll give people a chocolate, and then in the second year we'll give them a chocolate. People in this class a chocolate, and what we will find is that there's quite a lot of chocolates by the time you get to the end. But that doesn't mean it's made any difference. That just means that people who've dropped out, we don't know if they had any chocolates or not. We didn't look. And so they went back to the original paper and said, well, did we actually check this? Did we just check that the people who persisted are the people who persisted? And they got more of everything because they were there for longer. And we couldn't check that because the data set was closed. And we couldn't check that because both the researchers, who are good and well-respected researchers, no discredit to them, had moved on to different organisations and didn't work in a research field, so they couldn't be freed up from their work to go and replicate this. So we don't know. It's highly possible that the Purdue learning analytics are good, but we haven't got that definitive evidence that we thought we had in the first place, which was really disappointing. Now, seeing as I've been critical of somebody else's work, let me just be critical of my work. This is a piece of work that Doug and I carried out together. You don't really need to know about it. What you need to know is that this is a table which Doug checked, and I checked, and then it went into LAC, and so the reviewers for LAC checked it. And actually it was quite a good LAC paper, so it then went into the Journal of Learning Analytics, the same table. So the reviewers there checked it, and the proofreader checked it, and the editor checked it. And nobody spotted that there are a couple of at least one glaring error in it, which some of you may have picked out, but for those of you who haven't picked out, 0.2 might begin to give you a clue that everything else is a round number. Why if you suddenly put a decimal in? You might begin to think these don't add up to 100 at all. And actually, when we came to rethink it, when one of Doug's friends pointed out the problem, we realised that 2 of our figures were wildly wrong. So the amount of times that you check things, it is still difficult to get these things right. It didn't make an overall difference to the paper. Somebody along the way, one of us should have picked it up, and we didn't. So, does this mean that everything is a disaster? Everything in learning analytics is wrong, nothing is good, it's all as shaky as psychology, we should worry about it? No, of course not. We are the superheroes in the libraries, the superhero academics, who will solve the problems. We just need to think about how we're going to solve the problems and what we need to do in the future. So I'll tell you about some generic suggestions, and then I will tell you about some more specific things that can happen in an institution. And the joy of doing this presentation when there's 2 of us is we can do the next section in a much more interactive way, but we can't, so you'll just have to go with it online. Neither of us can be Bob Dylan throwing pieces of cardboard on the floor. So, we definitely need to use the peer review process to address this problem. We need to be giving much more specific instructions to our peer reviewers. These are things to look out for. These are things that have gone wrong in the past. And I don't know how, I would guess most of you do peer review for journals. A lot of journals don't give you any instruction whatsoever. They just say, here's a paper, give us a paragraph or 2 about what you think of this, or a page. That's not really good enough. We need something more specific. Go and look at these things. Really check these things out. Don't assume somebody else has checked the table. Before I was in academia, I used to work in proofreading, editing and journalism. People hate checking tables. You can get a table right to the end and nobody will have looked at it. They all assume it's somebody else's job. If you're a reviewer and you've got the stats expertise, you should be checking those statistics because nobody else will have done that. We have got big gaps in the evidence. When we looked at that Sankey diagram, there was a lot of evidence out of higher education But things around, for example, workplace training, very little evidence around it. We talk about evidence, about ethics a lot, not so much evidence around ethics. So rather than us all going for exactly the same space, us all thinking about learning in universities, we could be thinking a bit more broadly about what we don't know about yet. And when we're putting together special issues, when we're putting together events, we could be talking about those. Definitely strengthening the scrutiny of statistics. It's not just a question about the peer review process, it's a question about talking to the editors and saying to the editors, are you absolutely sure who's checked? Who was it who checked? And how do you know they checked? When there was a p-value, did you have a look at that p-value? Was it a p-value that made sense? When they said this caused this, was that likely? Or could it just have been correlation? Are you checking for these specific, really well-known errors? Have we got a checklist? Another thing we found on the LACE project, because we were working with people in industry, we were working with people in training, and we were saying, you know, can you give us some evidence? And they were going, no, we can't give you any evidence because we cannot access academic libraries. We can't see any of this unless an academic friend happens to tell us about it and happens to print it out. It is all behind paywalls. And that is still the case, I'm sad to say, for the LAC conference. So the Learning Analytics Conference is published by ACM, and that has lovely benefits for academic researchers because that means it's high prestige and we can cite it all over the place. But it is a real pain if you're a practitioner because you can't get at it. And so these lovely things we've found out don't get out there. So we need to think about how we're getting this message over to people who could use it outside our institution. We need to be thinking about these other fields who are more advanced in the use of evidence. We have got things to learn from the medical field. And actually, I was talking to a medical researcher at yesterday's event who was talking about making that shift over from medicine to teaching and where the changes are and where the overlaps are. If we ask authors where their work fits into the learning analytics cycle, we draw attention to the fact that we're not just expecting people to look at the data, we are expecting them to propose interventions, we are expecting those interventions to make some sort of difference, or if they don't make a difference, we need to know so we don't keep doing the same thing. So again, if we give people prompts, we can check what's happening. When we're bidding for grants, if we can point to a gap in the evidence, that's good, because grant bodies like you to have spotted a gap in the evidence. And if you're slightly higher up in the hierarchy and you're one of those people who gets to help write grant calls, well, find out where the gaps in the evidence are and put them into the grant call so that somebody actually does investigate that. Because again, we don't want to just keep looking at the same area again and again. And there are some areas in learning analytics which are much easier to look at. And we see a lot of people looking at retention in higher education. I don't know about your grant bodies, but all our grant bodies are interested in how we're going to achieve impact. And one of the big routes to achieving impact is getting this stuff outside academia, out to the practitioners. And even though we don't get all those citation kudos for getting in a much more accessible journal or accessible newspaper or on the local radio, that is a really good way of getting it out to people. So let's think more about how we can do that. And generally, all of us, we can all think about expectations about the quality of evidence, whether it's in our institution, whether it's when we're working with students, whether it's when we're editing journals, at every single stage, thinking about that quality of evidence. And working with doctoral students so that they know about these things from the beginning. So that I do see final versions of theses when I'm sort of bouncing them back and going, really, you should have spotted this fairly, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I can tell you the stats are wrong, so they're definitely wrong. So, those are some ideas. We presented those ideas last year at the LAC conference, and we have begun to see changes happening in the learning analytics community already. So, for example, in the call for papers for the conference this year, we were asking people, can you reflect on these specific things? You don't need to write them into the paper, but tell us about what you were surprised by. And was this surprise shared? And this is to stop the sort of paper that you get where people tell you with great excitement, I've researched this for a year, I found this out, and you think everybody in the classroom probably knew that to start with. You haven't found anything exciting. So think about that. Think about why you used that methodology and explain why you used that methodology. Because especially with new researchers, they only know one or two methodologies, and it's one of those, I've got a hammer, everything's a nail. I've got a methodology, everything fits into that methodology. Why did you use it to answer this specific question? What impact are you going for? If we are looking to optimise learning, has your research got any possibility further down the line to optimise learning? Or was it just a question which occurred to you one day and somebody gave you some money for it? Realistically, how are we going to change learning and teaching? And who is it who's going to do this? And how are you telling those people about it? Quite often I go to a conference and people are telling me with great interest about something which is happening in their institution. Great. Did you tell the head of programme? Did you tell the teacher? Did you go and work with the teacher to make the changes? Did you tell the learners? Or did you just treat it as an academic exercise and go and tell some other academics? And the other thing which is happening at LAC is we are thinking about reviewing, how the reviewing process works, who does it well, recognising people for doing this. Often conference reviewing isn't done as well as journal reviewing. You get a lot of papers at the same time. It is a tough call when you suddenly get 5 or 6 papers in your inbox and somebody says, can you come back to me in a fortnight and tell me if they're any good or not? But we're really interested in people reading these things carefully, in thinking them through, in not just telling people what's wrong with them, but telling them what's right with them. You know, thinking about how, if it's not acceptable for the conference, how could it be acceptable by next year? What do they need to do? Let's bring people on. So these are some of the things which LAC is doing, sort of as a follow-on to what we were doing on the LACE project. But another thing that Doug and I did was we thought about that balance of negative to positive evidence. And we thought, we need to pull out some of the things that are going wrong, because negative evidence is also useful evidence. I mean, you don't want people trying the same thing again and again and nobody ever reports it because it went wrong. So we ran a couple of sessions called fail-a-thons at the LAC conference. We said, bring all the things that have gone wrong in your research and tell us about the things that have gone wrong in your research. And we ran one of these in Edinburgh, and we had a room stuffed with people really keen to tell us about what was going wrong in their research, and really enjoying telling each other what had gone wrong with their research, because they hadn't had a chance to share this before. So last year we brought together a more international workshop, and so we had an organiser from South America, one from North America, one from Asia, one from Australia, a couple from Europe, to bring to perspectives from around the world. And we said, what can we do to avoid failure? And we did that in the workshop, and then we took the ideas from the workshop and we made a poster at the conference. And then everybody who went to the poster session at the conference, we said, here are some sticky notes, add some more ideas. Which of these things are going to work? What would you add to it? And coming out of that, we pulled this together into a paper which went to EDUCAURS about how do we avoid failure in learning analytics. So this is where I pull all the sort of negative stuff and failure into, this is what you're going to do at Justice, and it will be wonderful and you will avoid failure. Because we found unanimity really around some of the things that we need to do. And a lot of this ties in with what I was talking about yesterday around the visions and around the plan and around the strategy. Because when we talked about what went wrong, it was when we were missing those elements. So everyone needs to know what analytics are there for and why we are doing it. Not just us in this room. Everybody in this building needs to know why we're using learning analytics here at Charles Sturt and how it is going to help them and what the aim is. And we need to align that with what we are trying to do as an institution. How are we using learning analytics to live well and make this a world worth living in? Where are the overlaps? Where are the synergies? Where are you going? You definitely need some people in specific roles within the organisation. I pulled 4 people out whose pictures I came to first because I knew I was meeting them. So they won't necessarily be those 4 people, but they may well be. They will definitely have a role in who they are here. So we definitely need a sponsor. You need a champion at a high level within the institution. And we need that sponsor to know what can be achieved. We don't want a sponsor who comes in and says, I've heard about learning analytics, they're wonderful, they're going to raise our retention and they're going to do this, that and the other. And you're going, well, actually, they might do that 10 years down the line, but we're not quite there yet. We need somebody realistic. And we need somebody who can help make the changes. And you've got that, so you're good. You need project leaders who can help to deliver those specific plans. Because, of course, your sponsor's got lots of things on their plate. They're not spending their entire time on learning analytics. They just help you to make the big changes. And the project leaders need to be thinking about how this makes life easier. And I know from our own institution that you have really good ideas for initiatives, and you can see the positives, and then you take them to the staff, and the staff go, so I've got to fill in that form, and that form, and that form, and then you want me to go to that meeting, and what am I going to get in return? So you've really got to know about how this is making life easier in the long run, because if it's not, people aren't going to do it. They're not going to engage, they haven't got the time. You need to know about how you are measuring success. And that's sometimes things which we don't decide on the learning analytics project at the start. We just sort of put it into trade and see what happens at the end. No, where are we going with it? What do we mean to do? And when you've got those project leaders who are doing those good things, you begin to get your learning analytics champions, who are the people who are working in the classrooms, they're the people who are working in the libraries, they're people working across the university who are going, yes, this is a good thing, and I'd like to encourage people to engage. You need to know how this fits with the system across the entire organisation. Not just your department, not just your bit of the department, but across the entire organisation. How does it fit with what IT is doing? How does it fit with the systems you've got out there? How does it fit with how exams are organising stuff? How does it fit with how your registration process is happening? This one here is a sort of systems model which we developed at the Open University. Belinda Tynan, who now works at RMIT, but she was our Pro-Vice Chancellor then, she was working as the sponsor, and she said we need system models about how this works. We need to see the gaps, we need to see who's not talking to each other, and we need to find out why they're not talking to each other, or if they are talking to each other but they're misunderstanding each other entirely because they're talking in different contexts. You really need to think about how the assessment strategy aligns with learning analytics. So you sometimes see people building up learning analytics around, we're building learning analytics around collaboration, around students learning together, because that is a wonderful thing and we love that from the point of view of pedagogy. And then you look at the exam, and the exam is about a student sitting all by themselves with no support whatsoever, answering questions. Well, the student is going to go the exam route because that is what their success criteria is. So you've got to have that alignment. You need the capacity. This is something that came up yesterday. And so you need the people who've got those technical skills. And they're not just the data analysts. You know, everybody needs to begin to up their data literacy to some extent so that they understand the learning analytics outputs. They need to understand their limitations. You know, some of those limitations I talked about earlier, they aren't rocket science. They are things that you can quite easily understand, and they are things that you can look out for quite easily if somebody tells you about them. And these are things that students need to be aware of as well. You know, this is a really interesting, useful tool for students to take forward in life, to be able to spot these things that can so easily go wrong in research. In terms of ethics, we talked to people who had run into problems with ethics at their institution. You know, people haven't wanted their data collected. So we need to think about these things from the beginning. The idea about the student voice being heard. I don't know to what extent you've involved students in your ethical decisions, your data protection decisions, your privacy decisions. But if you haven't, now's a good time to start. Talking about the transparency. I was having a conversation earlier in the week and they were saying, well actually, what you've got to realise is these data can be weaponised. And they can be weaponised. They can be used to look at staff and see how staff are performing. They can be used to pick out which students we want to get rid of because they're going to be more hard work than other students. But if we make it transparent what we're doing, we make it clear that we're not doing that sort of thing, that we are using these for good. Let us use our data for good. And we need to be consistent, and we need to know those principles. And we don't just need to say there is a policy out there. This is your policy. I don't know if you've ever looked at your privacy management plan. It's not a terribly exciting read. This is the privacy management plan, brackets, the plan, of Charles Sturt University, brackets, the university, prepared as required by Part 3, Division 2 of the Privacy and Personal Information Protection Act, 1998, brackets, the PPIPA, Section 2. Right, who is going to get to anything which relates to them in that document? How many of you have got any further than Section 1 in that document? Because you have all signed up to that document and you've all agreed with it, and your data is being used on the basis that you agreed to that. And that's the same for your students. So it's worth thinking about these things and thinking about how you present these things. And then if we pull all that together, these are the things you have to do in order not to fail. Take a picture of this slide, do all these things, and your learning analytics will be wonderful and a success, and Charles Sturt will be heralded through the land as wonderful proponents of learning analytics. So I don't need to read you those things. These are things I've told you about. These are things which, consulting with people around the world, they have said, this is what you need to do to avoid failure. So it's straightforward. Do this, succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very provocative and challenging, and I think a nice perspective to bring into the conversation. Do we have any questions from people here?
Yeah, I've got one. So Rebecca, obviously many of these challenges, problems and pitfalls that you outlined earlier pervade many, if not all, areas of research and evaluation into educational innovations. And clearly, learning analytics as a field isn't immune to any of these problems. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how scholars in the field of learning analytics could possibly assist the wider educational research community in addressing some of the problems and deficiencies in their scholarship. So, for example, could some analytics methods and approaches, potentially be used to help educational researchers improve, and, to borrow a word from the learning analytics, optimize the way in which they go about doing their research?
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to be doing. I think what you find is that learning analytics researchers are quite often embedded in educational technology departments, in education departments. Yes, I think we should be getting these ideas out there, talking to other people about them. One of the things that Solar is doing is it has linked up with other organisations which run their own conferences. It's linked with, I think, 8 now, including the Learning at Scale community, the Educational Data Mining community. I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head, but those links are being made. And one of the things that is happening is that for each of those 8 organisations, the best paper at their annual conference, the organisation will then fund that best paper to be presented at one of the other conferences. So the idea is to get some dissemination out there and to cross-fertilise around our best ideas, so that we're not just talking as isolated communities, which so often happens, I think, in the field of education. There's so many different conferences, and people become quite tribal about, you know, I always go to the LAC conference, but no, I'd never go to the Learning at Scale. And one of the things we find at the Learning Analytics Conference, for example, is if you ask people to raise their hand if they've ever been to the International Educational Data Mining Conference, which is very, 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 very closely aligned, really, in subject, you can count on the fingers of one hand how many people have been to both conferences. And it's usually the president of the Educational Data Mining Society and the president of the Learning Analytics Society.
Barney?
I'm interested in what you said about, I think you said at a LAC conference, you had a fail-a-thon, and it's certainly the notion that generally only papers that find a significant difference when testing a particular intervention tend to be the ones that get published, and there may be hundreds of other studies of that same intervention which found no significant difference and don't tend to get published. So it's kind of an important thing to be doing, to be trying to find a way to report on studies that find no difference. But of course there's always a problem when you find no difference. It could be caused by too small a sample, confounding variables, or other methodological flaws. So I'm just kind of keen to hear a little bit more about when you asked for people to report failures, did you mean failure to find a difference, or where they found a significant negative impact of an intervention, which obviously is a finding that's more strongly able to be kind of reported?
When people were talking about these things in the workshop, they talked about all sorts of things. So they did talk about where they found no significant difference. It wasn't really worth writing up, they felt. But serious design flaws that they'd come across in their studies while they were carrying out their studies, which they hadn't noticed at the beginning. But again, they weren't sharing the design flaws with them. You know, when you've carried out a study and you realise you've got it wrong, you tend to keep quite quiet about it. You don't tend to tell your boss, you know, you remember that 6 months of work I did, that was a mistake, wasn't it? But so it's ways of thinking of sharing these things safely, and you know, it's something that could be done within the institution, within the local area. You agree at the beginning that though you might share non-specific details about cases, you're not going to say, oh, well, Barney said that he messed this up and Rebecca said that she messed this up. But you might come out with a sort of general, oh, remember that you always have to do X, that sort of thing. And we were also talking about in the journal, we might have a space for sort of slightly shorter reports, you know, a sort of summary of, tried this out, didn't really get us anywhere. You know, because you don't really need to read a whole paper to find out that things went wrong or that it wasn't insignificant, but it might be useful to have a paragraph or so finding out what people are working on.
Yes?
Do you think anonymising student data will get around ethics problems?
There was some work at, I think it was MIT, which said if you've got a couple of data points associated with each piece of data, you can de-anonymise fairly easily. And you know, if you think about data sets within your university, there'll be some people who are sort of outliers. You know, when I pointed to you, I went, that's South Africa, that's Paul, right? So I know that any piece of research which is coming out of the entirety of Africa in learning analytics is Paul Prinsloo, right? So you would think you could be fairly vague, you know, let's report this continent by continent. No, I know who that is. I could point to Uruguay, I could tell you who the person in Uruguay was, the team in Uruguay. So you'll have points like that where you go, okay, actually the only person taking those 5 courses is this person, or the only female taking those 5 courses.
Yeah, but that's okay. You've signed up to the agreement not to disclose information like that, but not the wider research community would be able to specify. Sorry, if you've got a student data, the wider teaching community or research community of that institution wouldn't be able to de-anonymise data.
Yeah, you could. I have seen anonymised work, and you sometimes can de-anonymise it fairly. I've read psychological studies where I've gone, let me just do a quick Google. Yeah, I know who that person is. You know, it's sometimes not as tricky as people expect it to be. One of the things that the learning analytics community is doing is working with synthetic data.
Just a comment about that. So one of the things that some of our researchers here at CSU are doing is actually swapping so that you still get the same statistical outcomes, but you swap pairs of data points to anonymise.
Yeah, and that can be a really powerful way in some circumstances, but again it depends what outcome you're trying to achieve, and if you're trying to achieve an outcome with a specific cohort of students, or if it's a more general point. But I think it's just something we're still wrestling with.
At heart too is you've got competing ethical sort of imperatives. So if you are able to bring data together so you've got more powerful data sets, you know, potentially you can get more explanatory power. And I think when we look at the replication crisis, a lot of that is that we've now got the methodological and analytical sophistication to look at complex phenomenon through a far more sophisticated lens. Whereas before we were relying a lot on bivariate and quite limited sort of lenses to look at something that was quite sort of needing far more sophistication. And I'm very interested in what you're saying, because I think the more we're able to pull our data together, because that data provides the richness of context, it provides us to look at learning as more nuanced and sort of in a more granular way. It's nice.
I think it's one of the reasons that learning analytics is moving over into the field of MOOCs quite strongly, because you do have these very large data sets and they are fairly straightforward to anonymise because you don't have so many other data points about the students.
I also think that without linking data sets up to get the clearest picture, you can run a risk of an incomplete analysis. Now sometimes it's really helpful, I believe, to have the small studies, the bivariate, to get a sense of how particular dimensions shape learning, but sometimes I think it's really nice to throw as much as we can in to also get a sense of how intersectionality across dimensions works to shape them. I think the replication crisis wasn't just psychology. I wonder how much of that actually exists in the education literature. And it's ironic that even within learning analytics, which brings to the education field new tools to interrogate large sets of data, and so that can be a richness. Even within learning analytics research, sometimes we construct learning in a very narrow way. So it's good to see the replication coming into it. Oh, we're wrapping up. Oh, I'm sorry, people. I've talked and stopped your questions. Apologies, I thought we had longer. This is another smaller gift. We gave you a large one yesterday, and it's really to thank you both for your two wonderful presentations that have already started a lot of talk, particularly even within my team, but also for your time in the community. I know that you've spoken to many people in this room and made some wonderful connections, and I've really enjoyed hosting you.
I've really enjoyed visiting. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Cass, for all of your hard work behind the scenes, securing Rebecca to visit us here in Wagga at CSU. So just in closing, thank you to our live stream audience today. If you have any feedback for us, if you'd like to send us a tweet to our hashtag, oops, that's not our hashtag. If you'd like to send us a tweet using We Imagine, that would be useful. And for those people that are here today, we'd really appreciate you to just quickly fill in a very short survey, just giving us a little bit of a feedback about today's guest lecture. And we'd love to get some feedback from you about other topics that you might like to have us hosting events for in the future. So thanks to the You Imagine team for all the hard work in pulling this week together. Thank you to the ALTS team for all of their hard work in pulling this together. And thanks for actually for coming and sharing this morning with us. So thank you.